Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another conversation contemplating divorce. Should you stay or should you go? And today we're going to talk about assets. So, assets are the things that you own, the things that have value. And I'm joined today once again with my wonderful co host, Allison. Allison, how are you today?
I am
And what?
wonderful, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. We're going to try and make it less daunting and a little bit lighter than I know in your hearts. If you're listening to this, you're going, oh, but we're going to try and make this a little bit easier than it might be otherwise.
I think a lot of times too, uh, people, or at least I've seen people say, well, I don't have any assets. I don't have anything. And I think you might be surprised. Um, and my dog is in the background. He has decided that he wants to participate on the call today too. So hopefully he won't be too noisy. But I think one of the things that is important to get your arms around is just where you are today with everything. And it's not good, it's not bad, it's not that uh, you haven't accomplished what you had hoped to accomplish by some certain age, and or you have and you've exceeded it. It's not anything about that. It's not the ego aspect. It's just getting it down on paper so you know where you're starting from. And then later on we can talk about like where you're headed, but we all need to know where we are now so we know what we need to do to get to where we're headed. Wouldn't you agree, Allison?
Oh, absolutely. And, there's that old saying, start with the end in mind. And how do you know where the end in is if you don't know where you're even starting? And so that's where all of this, and we talked earlier that it's kind of like doing your taxes. Creating a budget is something that we all kind of avoid and kind of postpone. But the reality is, the sooner we do it and the sooner we get it down so we know what we're working with, what we have to work with, what we don't have to work with, then we know what our options are. Then we can figure out where we're going. So this is kind of one of the best starting places, is gathering and getting ready and learning what goes into the budgeting process and what you need to look for to
Right,
make that happen.
exactly. I remember years ago, I was in our industry, a sales conference. One of the leaders, he's written many, many books, and I was reading one of his books, and he started it out. It was all about sales and growth and business planning and all these sort of things. But he started out telling a story about how most people don't plan for their life. Actually, they don't have business plans, they don't have marketing plans, they don't have divorce plans. He didn't mention that, but he took us back to the story of going on vacation, and he said, when have you ever gone on vacation and you just woke up that morning and said, oh, let's just like throw some stuff in a suitcase and go hop on a plane and go somewhere? You don't go on vacation that way. You schedule the time off, you figure out where you're going, you make reservations, you figure out what your transportation is to get there. And then, like, as you're packing, if you're going to the beach, you're packing a certain type of clothing. If you're going to the mountains and it's going to be cold, you're packing something else. So there's planning that goes into vacations. And we often plan a lot more for our vacations than we do for anything else in our life. And we need to be planning for all these other things. So I think whether you end up going through a divorce, you work it out and you stay where you're at, this is an incredibly good, healthy exercise to go through. And every one of us should go through it, not just once, but periodically, because life changes, right? Even if you stay single, stay married, or stay whatever. So in looking at assets, one of the things that you want to identify, if you're married, and you're thinking about divorce is what you have and who owns it. That's probably one of the things that I think a lot of times people get lost in. And for example, if you live in a community property state and you married somebody who already owned a house, well, that is his house prior to the marriage, and it's not marital property. But yet you married him, you moved in, you lived there for 10 years or 12 years, and now you think that that's your house too. So it's real important to understand who owns what, or if it's owned jointly, who's legally responsible. So those are some little nuggets that are important to I don't know, identify. That's the word. And then, like, is it transferable? If you own something jointly and you're going to split up, is that transferable to just one of you, or are you going to have to like dispose of it and split those proceeds up? But I thought it'd be kind of helpful, Allison, for us to run through some of the things that are pretty obvious to most of us is what an asset is, and then maybe kind of ramble on the things that just kind of come to mind. We brainstormed on them before, of the things that aren't so typical that often trip people up because they totally forgot about it. They didn't think of it as being an asset. Before we do that, anything that you can think of that you want to add to this whole whose is it, yours, mine, or ours?
No, it part of it is, and you mentioned that the house that he owned prior to coming into the relationship. One of the things to realize is that knowing that it was his before you came into the relationship, but then the question is, so what happens with that 15 hypothetical years you threw in there? Who was making the payments? What checking account were those payments coming out of? Is your name on that checking account? Is your money going into that checking account? Those are questions that are helpful to know. If it's his house and it's separate property, then it's up to you if he chooses to disagree with your thought process here. Then it's a matter of you being able to show why it is now community property, because the payments have been coming out of your paychecks, or the payments have been coming out of, a joint account where your money has been put in. So that's one of the things to think about, is where it started and where it is now, especially in a community property state.
That's so true. And I think we could have like one entire podcast just on that one topic, because what happens is, it doesn't matter if it's he had the house or she had the house, but one person had the house prior to the marriage. Then you get married, then you get married. What a phrase. Then you get married. And let's say you're both working, or maybe one of you isn't, but you brought assets, you brought cash, money to the household, and that money's commingled, or even could be in separate accounts. But if the person who did not own the house is making a financial contribution to the house, whether it's every single month, whether it's once a year, whatever, what that does create, it doesn't create ownership, but it creates an interest in the property. And so if that's you might want to go back and start making a note of what you've done to contribute to that, contribute financially to that house, whether it's you pay the annual property taxes every year, or you contributed monthly or whatever. But that could be really a 30-minute podcast all on its own, just that one thing. But that's such a great point, Allison. So, property is, or a home is like the number one thing that people say, well, we own a home together. And that's kind of easy, but don't forget, like, if you have investment properties, if you have rentals, if you have a second home, if you've been in the VRBO little business and you're renting out some stuff, you've got raw land. Hey, who owns some raw land that the husband has a hunting cabin on and he and his buddies go to every year? You know, don't forget about all those little nichey things that don't automatically come to mind.
Well, and when you're speaking about properties, one of the places where people get tripped up, and I've got a girlfriend going through this, she inherited family land and now she's going through a divorce. And so this is where she's been very smart and paid attention and ensured that she made all the payments out of a separate account. So whether it was the taxes, the mortgage payments, any improvements on the property, she was clear that all the money's going into that inherited property were all paid out of her accounts, because what's the first thing that happens when she says, I'm going to get divorced is, and they're going to sell now this property, he wants half the equity. And it's okay, but you took care of making sure that as separate property, it remained as separate as it could be financially. And so we all end up with, you know, a part of a house with our parents or whatever. And this is where to be very careful. If just because she inherited this while they were married and they actually lived on the property, she was careful to ensure that she retained that clear ownership as separate property, not putting his name on anything, not paying anything with his funds. But when you do have that separate property, there's that, oh, well, you inherited it while we were married, it's half mine. Separate property, still separate property, if you maintained it as such. And that's where it's if it's there, it's always good to put it on that list of possible assets. Because if you're getting divorced and the divorce goes on, he could be coming asking for that. And you need to be prepared to defend that position, that it's not joint property.
That's such good advice and so important. And I have a story of a young woman. She's actually a family member. She is in a serious relationship with a young man, and he has, if I understand it correctly, he has he's going to be the beneficiary of his parents' property. Well, she's the beneficiary of some assets from her father. And so she was saying that, telling him, you know, hey, if we do ever get married, I think it's really important for us to have a prenuptial agreement. And he was just like, why? You know, and he was very surprised by this and didn't understand why in the world she would want that. And so she said, well, she says, let's say we got married and we're married for certain length of time, and then one day, you know, something happens and we end up getting divorced. Do you really want to own your parents' house with me if you're not married to me anymore? And he had to think about it, you know, just, I guess because we tend to think, especially if we're young, you know, we're going to get married and live happily ever after and everything's going to be a bed of roses. But I was just so proud of her for thinking of that. And it wasn't just self-preservation. She was also thinking about him, and like, that's your parents' home. You know, that has not just financial value, but emotional value and all those things. And you wouldn't want an ex-wife attached to that. So I was thrilled to hear that people are thinking wisely as they move into things like this. And certainly as we become more and more of that sandwich generation, where we're taking care of our young people and we're taking care of our aging parents. And I'm just hearing more and more these days of people in my age group taking care of their parents. And I think we're going to see more and more of this come into play as we do that. And then, you know, you've got not just their home, but then their expenses and the medical issues and all that that's tied to it. And so it can get really messy if you're going through a divorce. So I'm certainly identifying these things early on is going to be helpful to people, I think.
And one thing that I do with my clients is from the first minute we start talking, whether they're going to go through with the divorce or not, I start a spreadsheet for them. And on it, I place everything that sounds like an asset or a liability. So assets, your home, your cars, your vacation property, your VRBOs, your investments, your jewelry, whatever it may be. I start just putting it on there, because the problem is we can sit down and we can say, oh, well, my only assets are my house and, maybe my savings account or my investments. But the reality is we have assets all around us. Your furniture, the things in the house are assets in their own right. So it's a matter of being able to sit down and start saying, what do I have, and putting it in one place. So if you're not an Excel spreadsheet person, which I'm an Excel girl, I love Excel, put it somewhere. Get yourself a little notebook, a notepad, or a place on your computer where you can just take notes. Whenever you think of something, whether it's an asset or liability, start jotting it down. Start getting those ideas down on paper. So as we go through the list of what are potential assets that could come into play in a divorce settlement, start taking notes or thinking through, what have I got? Or do I have these things? What don't I have? And start asking those questions. It's always better to have too much stuff on your list than not enough. So no matter what happens going forward, start now. Start thinking it through, because down the road, when push comes to shove, you don't want to be leaving mediation or leaving the divorce court and all of a sudden going, oh, I forgot something. Now what? You want to be aware of it up front, because everything comes into play in the negotiation, which most divorces these days are settled at mediation, which is where it should be, between the two parties coming to an agreement. But what happens when you forgot about that one thing or that other thing, and now you opened Pandora's box again? So let's start making notes now and putting it on that list.
And that forgetting something can open Pandora's box in two different directions. Honest mistake or not, it doesn't matter. You didn't put it on the list, and if it's something that he has and you were entitled to part of it, and he's not going to mention it if you don't mention it, then you just missed out. And so it's important to and make that list dynamic, meaning just keep adding to it as something pops in your mind as you're doing chores around the house. Run over and jot it on the list. So let's run through some of those things that people might not think about readily. I mean, I know, or I don't know, but I would imagine that most people, like you said, Allison, they're going to think about the house, the car, the savings account, the 401k. But what about the life insurance policy? What about stocks and bonds? What about those? I don't know if you remember these, Allison, the little Series E and EE bonds that people used to buy, and they buy them either for themselves or their kids, and they come out, they're like little coupons. And I remember my ex-husband had like a stack of them in one of his top drawers. And we forget about things like that because they're not, when you're buying them, they're not real expensive. They gain in value over a long period of time. So it's something that gets tucked away in a sock drawer or something, perhaps. Coins, coin collections. There's just so many. Jewelry.
And I always tell my clients, anything that you would possibly put in a safety deposit box, that's a good place to start, because that's the stuff we put away and we forget about. That needs to go on the list, is what's in your safety deposit box. The other thing that you made me think of, we talk about stocks and bonds and 401k and investments, but what if you worked for a company that gave you stock options? we may think, well, they're not real. We haven't executed them. Well, guess what? If your husband worked for Google or Facebook way back in the day, and they have all these stock options or stock grants or anything like that, preferred stock, all of that has value, whether it's been exercised or not. And so
It
those are things to
does.
think about.
And here's the thing that's important to know too about stock options is that if there is a merger, an acquisition, a lot of times those stock options that triggers expiration date where you have to, or exercise date, where you have like 3 years or 5 years to execute that, or else it is not even worth the paper it's on. So those are important things too to be mindful of and to know, okay, well, this merger happened 2 years ago and we have 3 years left to exercise this option, and it may or may not have value now or at that point in time, but here it is. It's something we have. And what about I've heard so many times talking to people that, if they've had several jobs, as they leave and go to the next job, they just leave that 401k in place and they don't roll it. And then sometimes they kind of forget they have it. I mean, I'm sure they don't totally forget because it's money, but out of sight, out of mind, they're not working at that company anymore. And they're only thinking about the one they have at the present job. So that's another thing to, make sure you've got your arms around.
Absolutely, because if you look at the compounding effect, that job that you had for 10 years when you were in your 20s, depending on how you invested that money and how it's grown, that could well have more money in it than the 401k that you have in your current job where you're making more money, therefore contributing more, but it hasn't been there as long. So don't discount any 401k or any savings that have come along the way, because if they're paying interest on it, that interest does compound. And over time, it can be quite significant.
It certainly can. Uh, Another thing too is, everybody's been dabbling in or caught up in the whole crypto, EFTs, NFTs, all of that digital currency. And I know for myself, I dabbled in it just a tiny bit. And now I'm trying to figure out how to get my money back. And I can't figure it out. And I keep writing these, help tickets to the support. Like, okay, I tried this, these were the steps you gave me. It doesn't work. I don't know how to do it. But I know a lot of people have been very successful with it. And you want to make sure you find it, identify all those places, because there's so many different types of coins and cryptos out there. And those two words are probably the same thing. I don't know. I don't know enough. I know enough to be dangerous. But, make sure you identify those, because it is money, or it can be converted into money.
And that's a really good call out, is you'll know if someone's been investing in cryptos unless they've been very sneaky about it, because they're going to talk about it, because it's, exciting and it's volatile and people tend to talk about it. And that is going to be on their computer, but you will be kind of subject to them telling you what they put in there, unless you hire a forensic accountant that can determine how much money has gone into them. And then you know where to go to look for them. But yes, they're very decentralized. And depending on which cryptos they invest in, it could be on any platform. So there could be 4, 5, 6 different platforms that a person's investing in based on the currencies that they're working with. And the other thing to think about is silver and gold. A lot of people have been investing in silver and gold. We forget about that. We mentioned the jewelry, we mentioned the savings accounts, we mentioned the stocks and the bonds, but what about, is there some physical silver and gold somewhere? If there is, that has value too. And that needs to be accounted for.
And for people that are in an older generation, I'm talking about me, silver can also be your flatware. My grandmother at the time that all of her grandkids were born, she started a collection, a silver collection of, flatware, forks, knives, and spoons for each of us. And then when we were, I don't know, 18 or 20, she gave us the pattern. And so, and back then that was pure silver. So, don't forget that if you got some. And then there's some of the things I think that we don't think of as, well, they're not, I guess, traditional assets. Um, you've got art, you've got wine, sports memorabilia. There's so many things of that nature that have incredible value. Obviously, if you're an art collector, you're going to know you have art. But I think, like the wine collector, they may know, hey, I've got a wine collection of X amount of value, but they might not think about it in terms of the assets, on their balance sheet, so to speak.
And we use the term collectibles, and that seems to be the, oh yeah, collectibles, but reality is coin collections, stamp collections, like you said, sports memorabilia, any kind of collections of anything that could have value. It can add up to a value, and not always in a monetary sense, because if it's something that you collected together, there's always the negotiation factor. And I want to put this out there for you, is that if you're going to go through the divorce and you're going to have to go to mediation and you're going to have to come to an agreement of what you will both take, there are things that are assets in their monetary value, and there are things that are assets in the psychological or emotional value. And they become how you negotiate to get what's important to you and what you need to take care of yourself going forward. So when you're taking a list of these assets, even if you say in your head, oh, well, his gun collection, that's his. We've been married 20 years and he's bought a whole lot of guns and that's his. And I don't want to touch that because I'm not a gun person, which I'm not, but okay. But at the end of the day, do I want his guns? No. Am I entitled to half of those guns if they were purchased while we were married and we can't prove where the money came from? Yes. So I might be. Do I want to have that on my list because it becomes a negotiation tool? Yes. So assets, it's not just about their actual value in dollars, but the value of what it will get you in what you need or what you want in the property distribution. Things have value that's not always financial.
That's an excellent point. And it's something that we can't forget, because when you do sit down for that negotiation, and you get past the big items, because we know that the big items are, first on the list, and you start getting into these little things like the gun collection, or I don't know, the four-wheelers, or the jet skis, or whatever it is, you can trade dollars for that. Like, I don't want the jet skis. I don't want the gun collection. I don't want that. But in lieu of my interest in that, how about I get more dollars over here from this item? So that's how that negotiation, so to speak, can play out, is basically identifying a value and then figuring out what you're going to trade for that value.
Mm-hmm. So the end, kind of the summary of when it comes to your assets, is anything can be an asset, whether it's financial or negotiation, an asset to negotiation. So the sooner you start putting this down on paper, the sooner you start bringing this together, the sooner you're going to know approximately where you're going to stand when all this is over, to help you start making some decisions about your life and your lifestyle going forward. So it's one of those things that, yes, it's stressful and it's traumatic to have to do, but when it's done, what it's going to do for your stress level, what it's going to do for your ability to see the future as it can be, with all the wonderful things that'll be in your future, it's well worth getting it done early and now and getting it over with.
And even if you don't, oops, I knew I couldn't make it through this without him barking. And even if you don't get a divorce, it is so well worth knowing where you stand as a couple, knowing what you have. It's just an exercise I think everyone should go through, regardless of what your situation is.
Absolutely, I agree. If you can patch your marriage up and you're going to be together, part of being that spouse that you need to be and present in that marriage is knowing what's going on. And this is a good first step to that.
Well, I think that kind of wraps it up, but I would love to hear from anybody that's listening in now or in the future. If you have some things that you've come across as assets that we didn't mention, be sure to put them in the comment section because I'm sure everyone would value from that input. So next time we're going to talk about liabilities, but it has to be talked about, right, Allison?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
So hope you join us next time. Be sure to give us a like, share this with anybody that you know that could get some value from it, and join us next time.